Iran's nuclear deadline looms. 10 days to chaos.
The fluorescent lights hummed in the basement of the Denver Federal Building. Special Agent Marcus Webb stood before a wall of screens, each one displaying encrypted files, financial ledgers, and surveillance photographs. Outside, snow fell silently across Colorado. Inside, the weight of what they'd uncovered hung in the air like smoke. "This isn't about one cartel anymore," Webb said, turning to face his team. "What we're looking at is systematic infiltration, a criminal enterprise that didn't just operate in the shadows. It became the shadow. 3 months of investigation, 200 seized servers, over 900 financial transactions traced across 17 states. What had started as a routine DEA wiretap on a suspected drug trafficking operation in the Southwest had unraveled into something far darker. A revelation that corrupt officials at multiple levels of government had deliberately created safe corridors for one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in North America, the Sinaloa Cartel. The story of how this happened, how power, money, and silence had transformed an entire region into a cartel fortress. This is that story. It started at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, in a warehouse district outside Albuquerque, New Mexico. The night was cold. Streetlights cast orange pools across empty roads. A few semis sat parked near an industrial complex, their engines cooling. Nothing suggested what lay inside Building 7. At exactly 3:47, the silence shattered. 12 FBI SWAT agents in tactical gear moved like ghosts through the loading bay. Behind them, DEA teams in identical black uniforms fanned out across the perimeter. Their boots hit concrete in synchronized rhythm. Weapons raised. Eyes sharp. The flashbang came first. A deafening crack that turned night into day for a fraction of a second. The door buckled inward. Agents poured through the opening, calling clear, clear, their voices controlled and precise. Inside, the drug superlab sprawled across 10,000 square feet. This wasn't a small operation. Industrial-grade equipment lined the walls. Pill presses the size of refrigerators. Mixing vats. Centrifuges. Scales. The air smelled of chemicals and industrial solvents. Acetone, ether, precursor compounds that could turn into anything from fentanyl to methamphetamine. On the sorting tables, 2.1 million fentanyl pills, stacked in vacuum-sealed packages, each one deadly, each one a potential death waiting to happen in some neighborhood 3,000 miles away. 3 men tried to run. They didn't make it far. Agents tackled them to the concrete floor, zip-tying wrists, reading rights through heavy breathing and adrenaline spikes. But the pills weren't what caught Webb's attention when he arrived 40 minutes later. Hidden behind a false wall in the back office, agents found something else. Steel boxes. Locked. Fireproof. Inside, encrypted hard drives. Ledgers written in code. And something more disturbing, photographs. Photographs of state officials, federal judges, border patrol commanders. All meetings with known cartel associates. All shaking hands. All smiling. "Get these to the lab," Webb ordered, holding up one photograph. "And run facial recognition on every single person in these pictures. I want to know who these people are, where they work, and what they've been paid." That night, they hit 6 more locations simultaneously. A drug fortress mansion in the hills outside Santa Fe. A human trafficking transit house in El Paso. A migrant smuggling convoy stopped at a way station that had mysteriously been closed for maintenance that exact morning. A hidden tunnel system that ran from a cartel-owned restaurant in Juarez directly under the border into a warehouse in Las Cruces. By dawn, federal agents had seized 847 kilograms of cocaine, 156 kilograms of heroin, 4.3 million fentanyl pills, 92 kilograms of methamphetamine, $23.7 million in cash, bundled and stored in shipping containers, 47 vehicles used for drug transport, 38 firearms, including 2 automatic weapons, 42 suspected cartel members. But the numbers weren't the story. The photographs were the story. The ledgers were the story. What those encrypted hard drives contained would rewrite everything anyone thought they understood about how deep the Sinaloa cartel's reach actually extended. 72 hours later, inside the FBI's Denver Cyber Forensics Lab, a team of specialists broke the encryption. What they found was meticulous, obsessive, a criminal organization that had moved beyond simple corruption and created something worse, a parallel government. The operation had a code name, Proyecto Puente, the Bridge Project. The network diagram that emerged from the servers looked like a spider web spanning the entire Southwest. Not just one cartel, but a unified command structure that had systematized every aspect of drug trafficking, human trafficking, and migrant smuggling across state lines. At the center of the diagram was one name that appeared in encrypted communications more than any other: Governor Raymond Castellano of New Mexico. Castellano: "I'm 53 years old, Ivy League educated, decorated political career, wife, 2 children, a man who'd been photographed with presidents, a man who'd given speeches about border security and the opioid crisis, a man who, according to the seized ledgers, had been receiving monthly payments ranging from $50,000 to $200,000, deposited directly into offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. In exchange, Castellano had done something remarkable, something that should have been impossible. He'd weaponized his office. The forensics team uncovered a series of executive orders, all issued under Castellano's authority, that had systematically created safe zones for cartel operations. The executive order had consolidated the state's internal border patrol grid, creating gaps in coverage that corresponded exactly with known cartel smuggling routes. Way stations on key highways were scheduled for routine maintenance on specific dates that matched the movement of major drug shipments. Inspection protocols were altered. Documentation requirements were reduced. The entire logistical apparatus of law enforcement was restructured to create corridors. It wasn't subtle once you knew to look for it. It was deliberate, strategic, the work of someone who understood government systems deeply enough to weaponize them from inside. He didn't just let them operate, Special Agent Jessica Park said, standing before the full network diagram. He designed the infrastructure for them. This governor literally redesigned state operations to facilitate cartel movement. The payments weren't the only connection. The encrypted communications revealed something darker. Castellano wasn't just taking money. He was planning expansion. Documents recovered from the servers outlined a 5-year strategic plan to extend cartel operations into Arizona, Colorado, and Texas. Not through violence or turf wars, but through political placement. Installing allies. Building a network of corrupt officials across the Southwest that would create a permanent, untouchable cartel headquarters spanning multiple states. One internal message, dated 14 months prior, was particularly chilling. It was from Castellano directly, encrypted and timestamped. The organization is not an operation. It is a government. When we control enough officials, when enough law enforcement follows our priorities, when borders become our borders and inspection points become our checkpoints, that is when we stop being criminals. We become the system. And systems cannot be prosecuted. Systems can only be replaced. Webb read those words 3 times. The implications crystallized in his mind like ice forming on still water. This wasn't corruption. Corruption implies weakness, opportunity, and individual moral failure. This was something else. This was command-level collusion. This was the deliberate construction of a shadow state, a mirror government designed to serve one organization instead of the people it claimed to represent. How many officials are we talking about? Webb asked. The numbers came back within the hour. Across the state of New Mexico alone, 7 state senators, for state representatives, 12 municipal judges, 18 border patrol agents, 43 state police officers, and 1 federal prosecutor. All on the cartel payroll. All making deliberate decisions that facilitated drug trafficking, human trafficking, and migrant smuggling. And that was just New Mexico. Colorado had 12 officials compromised. Arizona had 19. Texas had over 30. In total, across the Southwest, federal investigators had identified 127 state and local officials who were actively receiving payments from the Sinaloa cartel in exchange for dismantling the structures designed to stop them. The underworld didn't just infiltrate the system, Park said quietly. The system became the underworld. It became a tool of the cartel. The command decision came from Washington. At 4:15 a.m. on a Friday, Department of Homeland Security Secretary Jennifer Valdez sat in the Situation Room with the FBI director, the DEA administrator, and ICE's deputy director. On the screens before them, a digital map showed the entire Southwest lit up like a Christmas tree, red markers pulsing over every identified location tied to the Sinaloa cartel's New Mexico operations. How many agents? Valdez asked. 1,234, came the response. 47 SWAT teams, 32 Black Hawk helicopters, Border Patrol support, state police coordination. This will be the largest coordinated federal operation in the Southwest since the initial border surge. The operation was called Operation Clean Sweep. It would unfold simultaneously across 7 cities and 23 identified cartel locations over the course of 6 hours. At 5:30 a.m., the order came down, execute. The Blackhawks were in the air within minutes, their rotors splitting the pre-dawn darkness. On the ground, federal agents moved in coordinated waves, breaching locations with synchronized precision. In Albuquerque, a drug fortress mansion perched on a hillside with panoramic views of the city fell in 17 minutes. Agents rappelled from helicopters onto the roof, smashing through skylights, moving room to room with weapons raised. They found cocaine stacked in master bedroom closets, heroin in the wine cellar, fentanyl pills in the kitchen pantry, and in the study, a server farm so sophisticated it looked like something from a technology company. In Las Cruces, agents hit the human trafficking transit house where 12 migrants, including 3 children, were being held. The rescue was brutal and swift. Doors came off hinges. Agents secured the premises. The captives were moved to medical facilities within 20 minutes. In El Paso, federal teams breached a cartel-run logistics operation disguised as a trucking company. What they found was the nerve center of the entire Southwest distribution network. Communication logs, shipping manifests, route planning, the physical documentation of how the Sinaloa cartel moved tons of drugs and hundreds of human trafficking victims across state lines while evading law enforcement. In Carlsbad, a hidden drug tunnel system, 7 miles long, accessible from both sides of the border, was discovered, mapped, and secured by military engineers. By 11:45 a.m., when the coordinated operations concluded, 387 cartel members and associates were in federal custody. 247 weapons were seized. 1.2 tons of cocaine were recovered. 340 kilograms of heroin were recovered. 8.7 million fentanyl pills were seized. $67.3 million in cash and convertible assets were secured. 43 individuals identified as human trafficking victims were rescued. 89 individuals involved in migrant smuggling operations were arrested. But the most significant arrests were yet to come. At 2:17 p.m. that same Friday, federal agents moved against the internal targets. Governor Raymond Castellano was arrested at his office as he was signing routine legislation. He didn't resist. He simply stood, hands placed on his desk, and waited for the handcuffs to click shut around his wrists. But Castellano was only the beginning. What emerged over the next 72 hours was a systematic examination of how thoroughly the cartel had infiltrated law enforcement itself. Sheriff Deputy Chief Thomas Mendez, 23 years on the force, decorated, respected, had been receiving cartel payments for 6 years. In exchange, he'd altered patrol schedules to create gaps in coverage. He'd leaked raid schedules before they were executed. He'd falsified incident reports. When state police tried to move against known cartel locations, Mendez's doctored patrol grids ensured that backup never arrived. Federal prosecutor Rachel Delgado, a woman who'd built a reputation as tough on organized crime, had been systematically dismissing cases. Of the 47 prosecutions she'd handled involving Sinaloa cartel suspects over 5 years, 38 had been thrown out on technicalities that she'd personally engineered. The others had resulted in minimal sentences. She'd effectively created a legal firewall protecting cartel operations from federal prosecution. Detective James Harmon, head of the state police's organized crime task force, had done something even more damaging. He'd used his position to identify undercover federal agents embedded in cartel operations. 5 agents had been extracted in emergency operations after Harmon provided their identities to cartel handlers. 2 others hadn't made it out. These weren't corrupt individuals, FBI Director Sarah Chun said at a press conference that Saturday morning. These were members of law enforcement who had become a second police force, a cartel police force, operating not to protect citizens, but to protect criminal enterprises. The arrests continued. 17 state police officers, 8 border patrol agents, 4 federal employees, all on cartel payroll, all making conscious decisions to betray their oaths and their colleagues. The worst part wasn't the corruption itself, it was the methodology. The cartel hadn't just identified weak individuals and exploited them. They'd identified specific weak points in the system and placed people strategically to disable them. It was architectural, calculated, the work of someone like Governor Castellano, who understood government systems well enough to design their destruction from within. The cartel didn't infiltrate law enforcement, a DHS analyst noted in a classified briefing. The cartel hired consultants to rebuild law enforcement in their image. This was corporate restructuring. This was hostile takeover management applied to a government agency. When honest officers learned the truth, the betrayal was visceral. Detective Maria Ortega, who'd worked narcotics for 15 years and had never been compromised, sat in a briefing room and wept when she realized that the supervisor she trusted, the commander she'd looked up to, had been systematically undermining her investigations. "Everything I worked for," she said quietly. "Every arrest, every seizure, they were undoing it, from the inside. I was doing the job, and they were untying my hands on purpose." That realization, that the system itself had been weaponized, forced a complete institutional reset. But New Mexico wasn't the endpoint. It was a hub. As federal investigators dug deeper into the seized servers and financial records, they began tracing the distribution network. The Sinaloa cartel's infrastructure didn't stop at state borders. It was continental, transcontinental. From New Mexico, the network extended through carefully placed logistics companies, shell corporations, and corrupted officials in Arizona, Colorado, Texas, and California. But that was just the United States. Encrypted communications showed cartel operations coordinating with corrupt officials in Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras. Tons of narcotics, cocaine from Colombian suppliers, heroin from Mexican poppy fields, fentanyl manufactured in clandestine labs, flowed through Mexico into New Mexico, where they were distributed across the United States via a network of cartel-controlled logistics companies and corrupted law enforcement checkpoints. The system was designed to move products without triggering alerts. Weigh stations were staffed with cartel-friendly personnel who would look the other way. Shipping manifests were altered by corrupted port authorities. Documentation was falsified by people on cartel payroll. The cartel was moving an estimated 800 kilograms of fentanyl per week through New Mexico alone, enough to kill millions. But the drugs were only one part of the operation. The human trafficking component was equally systematized. Victims, many of them migrants seeking better lives, many of them minors, were moved through routes that had been cleared and secured by corrupted border patrol agents. Safe houses were operated openly because local police had been paid to ignore them. Victims were transported in vehicles that had been identified as low risk by colleagues of compromised law enforcement officers. The cartel had essentially created an underground railroad, not to freedom, but to slavery, exploitation, and death. One final discovery proved the most chilling. In the encrypted files recovered from Governor Castellano's private servers, federal investigators found a document marked Proyecto Futuro, Future Project. It outlined a comprehensive plan for cartel expansion across the entire Southwest over the next decade. It named specific targets: city officials in Las Vegas, judicial appointees in Arizona, state legislators in Texas, federal agents in California. The plan wasn't to overthrow the government. The cartel had learned something more sophisticated than that. It was to build parallel systems that could coexist with legitimate government while remaining invisible to it. They understand something fundamental, Webb told his team. They understand that you don't need to destroy a system to control it. You just need to own enough of the people running it. Make the system serve you instead of the people. And then expand, and expand, until the system becomes you. The implications were staggering. If this plan had continued uninterrupted for a decade, the entire Southwest could have become a cartel-controlled fiefdom operating under the appearance of legitimate government. By the time Operation Clean Sweep concluded, federal agents had executed 156 arrests. 847 charges had been filed. Over $140 million in cartel assets had been seized. 800 people directly connected to cartel operations, from drug dealers to human traffickers to corrupted officials, had been removed from society. But the real cost couldn't be measured in seizures or arrests. The fentanyl that flowed through the Sinaloa cartel's New Mexico hub had contributed to an estimated 12,400 overdose deaths across the United States in the year prior to Operation Clear Sweep. 12,400 people. Mothers, fathers, children, teenagers experimenting with a substance they didn't understand, purchased from dealers supplied by a network that had been deliberately protected by law enforcement. The human trafficking victims who passed through those safe houses, many of them never made it to freedom. Some died during transport. Others were sold into forced labor or sex slavery and never recovered. The trauma inflicted on survivors will persist across generations. The corruption of law enforcement created a secondary cost: the breakdown of trust. Officers who had been betrayed by their commanders questioned whether the system could ever be trustworthy again. Communities that had been exploited by a cartel, protected by the very people sworn to stop them, had legitimate questions about whether the badge still meant anything. This taught us something terrible, FBI Director Chun said in a follow-up briefing. It taught us that power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it doesn't need guns or violence. Sometimes it only needs silence. It only needs ambition. It only needs people willing to trade their oath for a monthly deposit in an offshore account. In the months that followed, the Southwest undertook a comprehensive reset. Compromised agencies underwent complete organizational restructuring. Training protocols were overhauled. Oversight mechanisms were installed. New leadership was brought in from outside the region to rebuild systems from the ground up. Governor Castellano faced 23 federal charges, including conspiracy to facilitate drug trafficking, money laundering, and racketeering. He pled guilty to all charges. His sentence: 42 years in federal prison. The corrupted officials faced similar accountability. Detective James Harmon received 35 years for providing cartel operatives with the identities of undercover federal agents. Federal prosecutor Rachel Delgado received 28 years for systematic obstruction of justice. Each officer, each agent, each official who had betrayed their oath faced criminal consequences. But the institutional damage ran deeper than any prison sentence could address. The Sinaloa cartel's network wasn't destroyed. It was disrupted, degraded, forced to rebuild. But the fundamental lesson, that a sophisticated criminal organization could infiltrate and weaponize government systems, remained. Federal task forces were permanently stationed in the Southwest. New oversight mechanisms were established. Federal judges were assigned to review prosecutions involving organized crime. Technology was implemented to catch falsified patrol reports. The system began its slow process of healing. But trust, once broken, regenerates slowly. This story matters because it reveals something that most people don't want to acknowledge. Corruption at the highest levels isn't always dramatic. It's often mundane. It's a monthly deposit. It's a patrol grid altered on a spreadsheet. It's a case dismissed in a courtroom. It's a deadline for an inspection pushed back 2 weeks. It's the thousands of small decisions made by people in positions of power, each one barely noticeable, each one trivial in isolation, but collectively creating a system designed to serve an organization instead of the people it claims to protect. The Sinaloa cartel didn't conquer the Southwest with violence. It conquered it with paychecks, with opportunity, with people willing to trade their integrity for money and the promise that no one would ever know. This is the story of Operation Clean Sweep, a story about how deep organized crime can penetrate when it has money, patience, and the ability to identify weak points in systems of power. It's a warning and a reminder that democracy, that the rule of law itself, is fragile. It depends on people choosing integrity over ambition, on people choosing the oath they swore over the offshore account offered to them, on people choosing to protect the system instead of exploiting it. The cost of their failure is measured in overdose deaths, in trafficking victims, in families destroyed, in neighborhoods where the drug epidemic isn't random, it's engineered. That's what silence costs.